All right, 2 verses. I said to the first group, we did 2 verses last week, but I had lost my notes multiple times, and it was mostly memory, and so this time I have notes, and it's going to be a long time. So we've got a lot to cover. 2 verses, 1 Peter 2, verses 11 and 12. Says this, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation." Peter is transitioning at this section in chapter 2 in talking to the church. He's going from how they interact with one another to how they should interact with those who are outside of the church. And we've talked at length about how churches are messy and we can fight and we can communicate poorly and we can have all those things. There can be hypocrisy and hurt feelings and expectations, and all that is true. And so he's talked to the church about how the church is to love one another. In fact, he started chapter 2 by saying, if you say that you love one another and don't fight against these sins, then you actually don't love one another. But now Peter's transitioning not only to the church corporately, but to every single person who would call themselves a follower of Jesus, how they should act and live outside of the church. There's really, we are tempted as a church towards isolation, to be reclusive, to when people don't like us, to hide and to just circle the wagons and wait. And that's not a good answer, and that's not what Peter would want for the church. And at the other time, we're tempted to neglect the church. I live as a millennial, which is almost not, it's not a popular thing. I don't think anyone's really been complimented like that recently. But within my generation especially, there's a lot of people that don't feel like they need organized religion or the institution of the church. That I feel at one with the Lord when I'm out hiking or climbing a mountain or whatever it might be, and so I don't really need the church. The church is filled with hypocrites anyways, and I hear that argument, and that's not a New Testament argument. Just a side note, side sermon, this is all for free. That's dumb, okay? That's because the primary way that the Lord works in His church is through His church. So when you disconnect yourself from the body of the church and then you pray that the Lord would do certain things in your life, the Lord wants to do those things, and the way that He does those things is through His body. Okay, so when you disconnect yourself from the way that God primarily answers your prayers and then you complain when He doesn't answer your prayers, that one's on you. Okay, that's a whole other sermon for another day, but this is the call to the church. You cannot hide and just hang out with one another, and you cannot hit eject and not be part of a church. You need to do both well. And to follow Jesus means you need to know how to act in both circumstances and situations. So he starts with, "Beloved." Seems minor, but it's actually important because this is a church that feels really far away. They're primarily Gentiles, and Peter's making the argument that all the promises that were true to the people of God throughout the Old Testament are true to them too. That they're just as much a part of the family as those who walked across the Red Sea and saw the hand and power of God. That they are part of this family of faith. And then he says this, "I urge you." The word urge can span kind of a pretty broad gamut, everything from encourage to beg. And this is more on the beg side. It's a strong, I'm begging you, encouraging you as, and now this is a qualifier. So before he gets to how you should live, he's going to qualify who you are, and who you are is going to define how you live. So here's what he says, as sojourners and exiles. I told you, when I took my kids to Disneyland, my son he walked into the gift shop that was the size of the rug here on the stage and asked me if it was Disneyland at the hotel because they were selling Mickey Mouse. I was like, man, we've waited too long. Right? He's like, hey, is this Disneyland? And the lady there was like, oh my goodness. No, buddy, there's something actually much better. Like, let's not spend too much time in the gift shop where everything's way overpriced. Let's go to another place that's way overpriced, just a few miles away. Right? So he's telling this church that you don't belong here long term. Camping is fun because you know it's going to end. Right? Like if you've ever gone camping and there's not an end date, that ain't fun. Honestly, even when there is an end date, it's still sometimes not that fun. As sojourners and exiles. Now, this kind of idea has been used to talk about the people of God throughout the Bible. This isn't new. This isn't the first time they would have heard this. In Acts 7, Stephen, who would be killed in this same chapter for his faith in Jesus and his outspoken message about Jesus, says this, as he's giving one of the most profound sermons in the New Testament. Verse 6 of Acts 7, and God spoke to this effect, that his offspring would be sojourners in a land belonging to others, who would enslave them and afflict them for 400 years. And so part of the story of God's people is that as they moved around, they were sojourners. They didn't have a land. Think of the word sojourner and exile as temporary resident and a foreign stranger. Meaning that where you are now is not where you one day will be, and where you are now is not where you really ultimately are from. This is not genuinely your home. Now, if we don't think like that, what he says next isn't going to make a ton of sense. If this is all there is, then do whatever you want, because who cares? But if this is just a very, very short stop in light of eternity, then it changes the way we live. Hebrews 11, as it lists off a long list of people who had faith in the Lord. Throughout the Old Testament, it says this about Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. It's an important statement because the author of Hebrews is demonstrating that even the promises that were given to them, so the promise given to Abraham is you're going to have a name, you're going to have land, you're going to have people. When he died, that had not all come to pass, but it says that they even acknowledged that even when it came to pass on this earth, that was still not really where it was going to come to pass. That even the land of Canaan was just a pit stop on the way to eternity. I've explained it this way. It's profoundly selfish, and I'm totally okay with it. I do not care if my great-great-grandkids do something awesome, if they're famous, or if they're rich, because there's no good in that for me. I'm gone. I don't get that. I don't get why, if I found out, if you told me, Blaine, your great-grandson's going to win the lottery the day after you die, I'd be like, that's the worst news I've ever heard. How about my kid wins the lottery before they're 18, and so it's actually I win the lottery, right? How about that, right? People are like, what about legacy? I'm not interested in that, right? Here's the same argument. That even the land of Canaan, even after they took the land, they still died. That couldn't have been the ultimate end of God's promises, and it wasn't. The land of Canaan was a dim picture of the glory of heaven and eternity. From the moment that Adam and Eve leave the garden, every single follower of God is now an alien and an exile because this world has an expiration date. And as long as your life and this world have an expiration date, don't invest it all here. If you knew your car was going to be stolen in the parking lot this morning, you probably wouldn't put all your nice things in it last night. I'm from Southern California. It's a different place. I had a friend who was a worship pastor, went to a Sunday night service, parked his car. He loved this car, more than he probably should have. He spent a lot of time on it. It was this custom, tricked out, in his mind, Honda Civic. So he goes, leads worship, car gets stolen, which, in San Bernardino, it's par for the course. They find it within 24 hours, completely stripped out, which actually I'm pretty impressed by. I was like, wow, that was my first response, not, oh, I'm so sorry. So, missed that one, right? That was his car he loved. It was just a shell of a car, right? If you know that car is not going to last forever, then don't put all your hopes and dreams for all of your future in it. This is the argument being made in this life. Don't give your entire life to a place that you're only going to be for a season. So if that's who you are, here's what you need to do. Ready? To abstain. And this is where church starts to feel like church again, right? Because this is what most people know about church. Tell me a little bit about your childhood growing up in church. Well, I wasn't allowed to do anything fun or happy, and I got yelled at all the time. People are like, no, that's kind of my background too. When I was a high school pastor, I remember we had these kids that would come and they would skateboard before youth group. And there was a lot of them. Self-inflicted. We had a skate park at one point, and then we got rid of it because insurance said, you did what? And then they just kept coming. And because, I don't know, I guess there was no other options, and so they kept coming to the Baptist church to skateboard around in the parking lot. And so they would come to church, and they would run over the pews, and I remember a lady coming up to me, and she was the kind of lady that most people think of when they think of church people. She said, how dare you let them run on God's pews? And I was like, first of all, if these are God's pews, we have really dishonored the name of the Lord. These are awful. And that's actually more concerned about their heart than I am about our pink pews. And yes, they were pink, right? If this is temporary, then let's not pretend like this is all that there is. We've got to abstain from some stuff. But when we even say that, we go, oh man, I've been told that. The idea of abstaining in the Bible is actually for your good. So the way I use an analogy with my kids is I tell my kids not to touch things because they're hot. They don't believe me. And so I'm blocking them from ultimate joy and happiness because whatever's on the stove is going to make their lives complete. Right? That's all they can think about. They obsess about it. They try to sneak around. And finally, parents, you ever get to the point you're like, fine. Like I'll hold a hose or something. I'll throw water on you when it happens. But go ahead. And they're like, what? And they're like, my life's about to change for the better because now there's no one blocking me from everything I've wanted. And then they touch it and they look at you like, how could you possibly let that happen to me? Like I betrayed them. Right? From that point on, they realized that what I told them was bad for them, they learned firsthand was bad for them. When the Lord tells you to abstain from something, He's not trying to ruin your joy because that's fun for Him. Sometimes we've thought of God in this way, that God is just out to ruin our happiness and our joy. I have been known to ruin parties by telling people what I do. They're just like, oh, okay, well, now we can't have fun. Right? Like that's how we think about it. But the idea of abstaining is that if you're not, you got to get away from some stuff because you're not going to live here. This is not all there is. I have a plan for you that goes far beyond what you see right now, and what you think will make you happy will betray you and lie to you. It won't make you happy. It will leave you empty-handed at the end of your life, filled with regret. It would have been better if you would listen to me. So abstain from the passions of the flesh. Now, hopefully, a majority of us aren't talking like this, right? If you go to a coffee shop and someone's like, how was your day? And you're like, well, I'm just fighting the flesh today. Like, that's weird, okay? And I'm just begging you to not say Eastmont's name if you talk like that, right? If we talk like that, we weird people out. Okay, so let's define what that means. Because sometimes we get to Bible terminology and we don't use it very much. And so we're like, that's creepy. What does that mean? And we don't define it. So what is the passions of the flesh? Well, in a general sense, it encompasses all that you would love to do had Jesus not intervened in your life. If you sat on the throne of your life and you did whatever you wanted to do, whenever it felt good to you, that's what it looks like. It's your general sin nature that will lead you to places that you would regret going. John defines it this way in 1 John. He says, for all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and the pride of life. The way John uses it is he uses it as kind of part of a third. So he says there's kind of three areas that encompass all sin in all human life, and it's the desires of the flesh, the desires of the eyes, and pride. So what you just intrinsically want to do that's wrong, what you see that isn't yours and you want to do that is wrong, and when you're prideful. These kind of encompass all of human sin. Paul would say in Ephesians 2, verse 3, among whom we all once lived in the passions of our flesh, carrying out the desires of the body and the mind, and were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. Paul uses it in its most general sense. The passions of the flesh just represent our default posture as human beings. That we do not naturally love God or the things of God, but rather we love just things that we love. Now, when we say things like this, it's easy in our Christian churchy world to hear, wow, well, before I was a Christian, I wasn't sinning at like 110% in every conceivable area of my life. And I have a lot of friends that don't know the Lord, and they aren't sinning at every area of their life at 110%. So what does this mean? It means that before you knew Jesus, you weren't motivated by love for Him or a desire to honor Him. It doesn't mean that you were full tilt, as sinful as you could possibly be all the time, everywhere you went. The idea of total depravity does not mean that you are as bad as you could potentially be, but the potential of all bad is in you. So let's explain it this way. Paul says that there are two things in the early parts of Romans that keep us from going as far as we could possibly go. First one is your conscience. Every person's born with a conscience. Consciences can be misinformed and they can be bypassed. I've got calluses on my hands from riding motorcycles and bikes. I think it's probably been 20 years since I have felt anything in this part of my hand. In fact, when I would ride dirt bikes before I sold it because I got hurt a lot, which I know shocks most of you, I used to have to get razor blades when we got and shave them down, right? So any of you grossed out now? That's why you're here. I would have to shave them down just so I could hold on to stuff because they would get so enormous and gross, right? That's a fun story for all of you, right? Here's the point. You can bypass, you can callous up your conscience. It can stop working. We look at some of the most evil things that have happened in human history, and they began with a seared conscience, making decisions that over and over and over assaulted the conscience. The second thing is punishment, the idea of government, that you can be in trouble. So when I moved up here, again, from Southern California, don't worry, it's been almost 7 years, so that doesn't really count anymore. Half of you have probably moved up from there since then anyways, so when I moved up, the first time I got on the parkway, like for the first week, we were speeding like crazy. And I don't think it was intentional, but like here's how humans should merge onto anything that has an on-ramp. It's foot down, everything you got, and as far forward as you can get in line, that's where you merge. Like none of this nonsense. Like if you've done this in the room, like I need you to hear me beg you not to do this again. If you stop on an on-ramp, turn your blinker on, and are looking over your shoulder, you've done something profoundly wrong. Okay? And I've seen that here, right? When you merge, it's everything you got, go, 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 and as far forward as you can get. It's like a game. That's how everyone should merge, okay? So we moved up, and first few times we got on, we were like 75 by the time we got onto the parkway. And that was just, I had to break that habit. I was like, what is wrong with these people? And then I realized the speed limit is 45. Like, what in the world? And there's bike lanes on there. This is a different world, right? And I just remember being like, this is wrong. Like, this is an injustice. But I have learned to drive that speed because, have I learned to love the speed limit? No. I still think it's ridiculous, but I do fear a ticket. Right? Now listen, nobody goes the speed limit because they just love that number. They're like, that's just an appropriate number. I feel like this is so fair and good and right, and so I'm going to be right there. No, everybody goes that speed because they don't have any money. And they don't want to get pulled over, right? So here's the point. In human depravity, there are restraining forces at work in the world. So when we say that we were saved from our flesh to the Spirit, doesn't mean that we're like, man, I was absolutely the worst conceivable thing. God's common grace showed up in my life to keep me from crossing lines. That can both be bypassed. They can both be overrun by sinful nature, but there are other forces at play. What he means here when he says this idea of from the passions of the flesh, meaning the before Jesus when you just loved you. What motivates you, what drives you, what gives you energy, what gives you purpose. For the Christian, it's loving the Lord because the Lord has loved you. And before you knew him, you weren't motivated by anything that was godly or good because nothing that was godly or good lived in you. Listen, because you went the speed limit doesn't mean that you're intrinsically godly. It means you're afraid of a ticket. Those are different things. So, abstain from all of this general things that can make you sin, this general idea of sin everywhere. Now, there's a reason that Peter's not specific here. Because some of us will go, I get a pass. It's like number 19 on my struggle list. I'm doing pretty good. This is for everybody. And everybody's passions of the flesh is going to look a little bit different. Abstain from that. Stay away from those things. Fight to get as far away as you possibly can because the next sentence matters. Which wage war against your soul. If you really believe this, you will live differently. If you actually believed you were at war with this and that what's at stake is your soul itself, I think it would motivate us differently. A.W. Tozer, I've read you this quote before, but it's excellent, so I'm going to read it again. He said this, in every Christian's heart there is a cross and a throne. And the Christian is on the throne until he puts himself on the cross. If he refuses the cross, he remains on the throne. Perhaps this is at the bottom of the backsliding and worldliness among gospel believers today. We want to be saved, but we insist that Christ do all the dying. No cross for us, no dethronement, no dying. We remain king within the little kingdom of Manzul and wear our tinsel crown with all the pride of a Caesar, but we doom ourselves to shadows and weakness and spiritual sterility. Here's his argument, that every Christian has to make a choice daily. Now, this is not positionally, this is practically as we live out life. Practically, we have to make a decision whether or not Jesus rules and reigns in our life or we do. And they are mutually exclusive. We cannot harbor some sin and then still follow Jesus. You have to make a decision. Does that mean that when you decide to follow Jesus, you never struggle with sin again? Not at all. Read Romans 7. There's this constant war, but here's what the war is for the Christian. I'll get back on the throne, Jesus, because you're Lord. And listen, that's every area of my life. Does that mean that you're going to perfectly submit in every area of your life all the time? No, but it means that your posture is, he's Lord, I'm not. Meaning, you cannot say to the Lord, you can have 99% of my life, but this is the one area I will not yield to you. Because in that moment, you've made a decision that you sit on the throne. A.W. Tozer is talking about dying to yourself every time. We have to believe there's actually a war happening, and that changes the way that we think. Let me give you another story. It's a dumb one, but it works. Okay, I grew up in the mountains, 2 different sets of mountains. Why it explains how I'm brilliant because of altitude and all that stuff. Mountain people are different than other people, right? And the first mountain set that I lived in, I sound like total hillbilly right now. In the first set of mountains that I lived in, it was a camp, and so there was no trash service. The trash service was, there was like a truck that they parked usually in the same spot, and then you had to go throw all your trash in it, which is, awesome, because when you're 13, guess what your job is? You ride your bike with all your family's trash and look for a truck that you hope hasn't moved. This is my whole life growing up, right? Trying to find the trash truck. So one day we were going down the mountain, which is only what mountain people say, and we didn't want to put the trash in our Suburban because then it would stink, and that's a bad idea. And so my dad held it out the window of our car, and where I live, bears were everywhere. Like, we saw bears like y'all see deer. Like, they were just living everywhere. And I know they weren't like the big kind of bear, but a bear's a bear, right? You fight a bear, you lose. So even if it's a little guy. So we're driving up to the truck, and we see 2, what we perceive to be small, pretty hairy legs. Again, we're in the mountains. That doesn't necessarily mean it's not a person. It just means they're one of our hairy friends. So Dad's driving up, holding the bag of trash out the window, and trying to get close enough where you can throw a trash bag backwards over into the trash truck from the car. You got to be real close to do that. So we're all sitting there listening to our Walkmans, and we round the corner, and that's not a hairy mountain man loading the trash. That's a bear eating dinner. So we pull up next to it. My dad's holding a bag to the bear. That changes everything, right? So we basically threw the trash at the bear, and he was like, this is awesome. Like, this is the best day of my life. People are throwing trash at me. And then we drove away as fast as we possibly could. All of us were screaming, right? Because if it's a bear, it can kill you, right? I guess a man that hairy could probably kill you too. But it's a different thing. If that's our neighbor, I'm not scared. If that's a bear, it'll kill me. Here's the point that Peter's trying to make to the church. You have got to realize that harboring, fostering, and protecting sin can kill you. It's at a war for your very soul. So when you round that corner and it's not your friend loading the trash truck, it's a bear that could eat your arm. You act differently. He's telling the church, eternity is coming, and on that day, it will matter what you did in this life. Paul would say this, the Apostle Paul in Romans 8. He's contrasting this idea of living in the flesh, which is doing whatever I want to do, whenever I want to do it, because I am the boss of my own life, to living in the Spirit, which means Jesus sits on the throne and I do what He tells me to do. Romans 8:5. For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit. For to set the mind on the flesh is death, but to set the mind on the Spirit is life and peace. For the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God, and it does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. He's making it incredibly clear that you cannot harbor, love, and continue to live in sin and claim to know and love Jesus. They are at war with one another. And he's telling this church, you have got to realize, before we talk about how you engage the world outside, there is a war for your very soul, and it's not them. Your heart would love to do what it loves to do, and in doing so, it would wander from the very God who saved you. A great hymn that says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. He is telling them all that you face, all the adversity, all the criticism, all that exists in the world outside of you is not your primary problem. Your primary problem is that there is a war for your very soul, and you're taking it too lightly. Now, with that being said, he'll move on. Last thing, just for a word from Jesus, Mark 8. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? That does not just mean material possessions. You can forfeit your soul by being palatable to the culture around you. You can forfeit your soul by wanting to be seen as wise or respected or all the things that you might want. It can be relationships, it can be things, and it can be the way that the world sees you. And we're going to see really quickly that the way that the world sees them is a pressure that's on them. Not only are they fighting for their very soul because they love to sin, because sin is in all of us, but they're also experiencing a tremendous amount of pressure to conform to the culture around them and to abandon ship. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. The word honorable means like winsome. I haven't experienced that's a common term for church folk. Like, man, they're just so fun and easy to be around. Let me give you just a little anecdotal word. Sometimes we think that the world is out to get us because we're a Christian, and I hear this in the church world because I've been here my whole life. Well, I know that Jesus promised that the world was going to hate us. And I'm like, nope, they just hate you. Right? They don't hate all of us. They hate you. So there's obviously something happening here that's unique to you, not to all of us. You didn't share the gospel or tell anyone you're a Christian. You're not being persecuted for that. You're just unlikable. Like, the gospel's not offending them. You're offending them. You yourself personally are offensive, and every time you go around people, you offend them, and they hate you. Don't blame that on Jesus. He didn't do that one. There's a temptation for the church to go, well, there's a reason the world hates me, and then we act abrasive and awful, and then we're like, well, we feel validated because the world hated Jesus too. Well, they hated Jesus for a very different reason than they hate you, right? Like, everybody around you hates you, right? And sometimes there's some hard things that need to be told to people, right? This is my job, right? If you look around and everyone in your life doesn't like you, it's probably because you're unlikable. So don't blame Jesus on that. And listen, the opposite needs to be true of you. The opposite. Not abrasive and horrible, gentle and winsome and kind and appealing. We see that modeled in Jesus. I got to get away from that because I'm getting angry again. Okay. 2 Timothy 3 says this, having the appearance of godliness but denying its power, avoid such people. Paul's writing to Timothy and he's saying there are going to be people that are going to appear to be godly in the way that they speak and the things that they say, but what they say is actually really far from the gospel. So there's two things we have to navigate here. One is don't be offensive in your own person. Like, work on that, okay? Don't be an offensive, abrasive, harsh person, because you're creating barriers to them ever hearing the gospel. Secondly, the message that you believe in is offensive. If people will be offended by something, they should be offended by the message of the gospel and the truth of the Bible, not by you. I'll give you an example in our current world. I've told you many times, being a pastor is not like, people aren't like, that's awesome, man. Thank you. I have friends who are firefighters and cops, and I have the most respect for you guys. Kids at restaurants go to see you. They tell you they want to be like you. That has never happened to me, right? In fact, grown-ups tell their kids not to go talk to me because I'm crazy, right? This is what they think. In fact, I was sick this week, so I came in last night, worked through the weekend a little bit, got coffee to wake up, and when I told the girl, this is not a joke, when I told the girl I worked at a church, she took her break. She's like, oh, I got to go do something, and just walked away. I was like, all right. And then the other girl was like, what do you do? Talk to her. I don't think you want to know, right? So here's the thing. In our culture right now, Many of you know, if you've been at Eastmont for any level of time, I'm incredibly pro-life, but that is not a political stance. For me, that's a gospel stance. That's a created in the image of God stance. And so every year, we will do a Sunday on the sanctity of human life. I'm committed to that. As long as I'm here, I'm committed to that. But here's what I've watched happen recently as culture is shifting. Now the argument is that it's moral and good and right. And it's a human right to have an abortion. And I sit there and go, there's an appearance of godliness, of goodness, of care, but it's removed from the gospel of Jesus. It's removed from the truth of the creation. That there is an appearance of godliness. And so this church has been told to proclaim the excellencies of him who saved you. And to do it in a world that thinks very, very, very poorly of them. We know this because he goes on to say this, so that when they speak against you as evildoers. We're beginning to see glimpses of this in American culture. Some of you are like, no, we've been seeing it for a long time. I just haven't been alive that long, okay? I'll be honest with you. And we're watching church Christendom decline in America. I told the first group, honestly, I'm kind of okay with that. I'm grateful I was born in the 80s and not the 30s because I don't think I would have been a very good pastor in the 50s. I actually appreciate when people go, I don't believe any of that nonsense that you believe. I'm going, great, we can start there. Let's talk about how life works following Jesus as opposed to not following Jesus, and those are becoming more and more contrasted. So, when they speak against you as evildoers, the criticisms against being a pastor or being a Christian are moving from, well, they're just intellectually lower on the totem pole, to they have an immoral worldview. And we have this temptation to believe that we are always the first generation to ever face this. We are not. And this church had it much worse, and I want to show you why. In the early church, throughout the Roman Empire, first off, we have to start with Christian saturation. By the time we get to 3rd and 4th century, Christian saturation is enormous because the church took seriously the Great Commission and went to the known world. But early on, we're talking probably in the early 50s when this is written, Christian saturation in the Roman Empire is minimal. Nero will see them as an easy scapegoat because they're already being accused of being unpatriotic. They're being accused of being rebellious because they don't worship Caesar. He's going to peg them with the fires in Rome as a political way to get out of it. Christians are going to be accused of things that they had nothing to do with. But most of the people in the Roman Empire didn't know a Christian. So when they heard stories about these Christians, it was easy to believe them because they hadn't had a neighbor that was a Christian that had proven that wrong. Here's some of the things that were being said about the early church as they grew throughout Rome. We cover the first ones. They were rebellious. They were unpatriotic because they called Jesus the only true king. They were accused of being cannibals because they spoke of eating the Lord's body and drinking his blood. What we call communion as this sacred time to remember what Jesus had done was misconstrued to classify this group of Christians as cannibals, even to the extent that they ate their own children. They were called atheists, ironically. Not religious crazy people. They were actually called anti-religious crazy people. The reason was they didn't bow and pray to all the different gods that were reflected in the Roman Empire. And so when something bad would happen, they would say, well, it's actually the gods, plural, wrath against these Christians because they don't pay homage or honor the gods. They're a godless people. They were accused of incest because they talked about their brothers and sisters. And an accusation had gone around that early on Sunday mornings that they would gather in each other's homes, calling each other brother and sister, and the accusation was that was actually just incest and orgies happening under this group called Christians. And so the church is now being told, you go tell the world about the excellencies of him who saved you, and they're going, but this is what they're saying about us. This is what they're saying about, and they believe it. What do you do there? How do you dig your way out of that? How do you start that conversation? Well, the natural temptation for the church is go underground and hide. We can't do that because he just said proclaim. Bummer. Okay. So we got to have to go out there and say something, ladies and gentlemen. What do we do? The answer that the gospel gives and the answer that Peter gives is that you follow Jesus, that you love Jesus, and that you live a life that is consistent with what you believe. So you say you love Jesus and you say that this book is his word to you, then you're going to live like this book is actually an authority, and you're going to follow and love him, and then you're going to let the chips fall. Live a life of integrity, of honesty, so that, and here's the next section, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. It sure didn't feel like part of that early church that anyone's going to see them and glory in God. So how are they supposed to do this? By being consistent. By following Jesus, loving him with all their heart, soul, strength, and mind. And in doing that, the way they live would be a natural outflow of what they believed. Here was Peter's point. The Christian that the average Roman citizen interacts with should be a paradox. Because all the things that I listed previously, they believe to be true about this group of people, and then they meet one. They go, so you don't eat your children? Interesting. Actually, oh, wow, you're called to love and serve and care for your children well. Oh, your book says that you're not allowed to eat children. Interesting. Well, that's new. Didn't know that. Right? When they meet you, oh, you don't have a bunch of sisters that you're also married to? Oh, no, you just call sisters because you're part of this family of Jesus? Interesting. That's not what I heard. This is the point, that the Christian's life would stand in contrast to the accusations made, and given enough time of interacting and living life next to and with these people, that they would go, there's something different here. What I've heard isn't necessarily true. Maybe there is something behind this. Maybe there is something to this Jesus, and it's not because we went out to win an argument. We didn't go rant on our social media. We didn't do any of that. We just lived quiet and peaceable lives that honored the Lord, and in doing so, the people around them would give glory to God. Now, that sounds easy when you read it. It sounds really tough throughout the week. So let me give you 3 takeaways I think we can be challenged with in this. First, the church cannot hide, it cannot disengage, and it cannot hope for judgment on the world around it. So here's just my experience in church people. A whole lot of people are really non-conflict. Non-confrontational. I don't want to go out there and be pegged as crazy and insane, and so I'm just going to lay low and wait this one out. And when Jesus comes, I'll scream out, "Woo, I'm in!" And then we'll go to heaven, and it'll be great. So let's just kind of keep this quiet. Let's just be cool right now. Don't do anything crazy. And then you got the other group that's like, I'm going to tell everybody, even those who don't know me, everything I think. And this is wrong, and I hope that judgment comes on these people, and then you see this massive divide. People that are hiding because they don't want to be seen as whatever, and then people that are like, fine, you hate me anyways? Well, I'm going to say a whole bunch of stuff that you're going to hate even more. We can't be either of those things. The church cannot go into hiding, and it cannot hope poor things happening to the people who give them criticism. Here's maybe a practical example coming out of the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29, most people know because of verse 11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you, right? And you're like, yes, favorite verse ever, right? You put it on mugs, and you go, and you're like, the Lord is just so kind to me, and this is what weird Christians do, right? We put weird things on mugs out of context, and we go, whew, this is great. The Lord has promised me everything I'd ever want, and this is great news. That's not the context of Jeremiah 29. Context of Jeremiah 29 is the people of God have been taken into exile. So before you get to verse 11, you get to verse 7. Jeremiah 29:7 says this, but seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile. Sound familiar? They're living practically what the church is called to live spiritually. And pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. So how do the people of God live in exile in a world that doesn't like them? More than likely, they're going, I hope everybody here dies because there's been injustice and they've treated me poorly and they've killed family members. Like, I hope that God just smotes them or whatever, however you'd say that. But that's probably what we would naturally hope for and think, isn't it? Jeremiah, speaking on God's behalf, says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to seek the welfare of the city. Where the city hurts, I want you to show up. I don't want you to disengage. I don't want you to run away. I want you to engage in the city that God has placed you in for its good, and then I want you to pray for them. So what should the church do to model Jesus to the world? Seek the welfare of the city that he has placed us in and pray for them. knowing that we are in exile and this is not our ultimate home. Now, where does Jeremiah 29:11 come in? I don't want to do that. I don't want to do that at all. But listen, I have plans for you. Do you see how it shifts that verse? Plans to prosper you. Trust me. Church, I don't want to do that. I don't want to pray for them. They're mean to me. They're going to think I'm dumb or immoral. They're going to say all kinds of things about me. Go seek the welfare of the city, pray for them, and listen, I know the plans I have for you. This is not where you're going to spend your eternity. The second thing we need to take away, you are always, and I am always, an ambassador for the gospel of Jesus at all times, everywhere. Let's not get lazy or believe that the only time that we need to talk about God is within our small group or at church. The way you treat your server at lunch today, you're an ambassador of the gospel of Jesus. The way that you interact with your neighbor, the way that you interact with your coworkers, the way that you parent, the way that you do all of that is being watched. And people are looking to see, do you really believe what you say you believe? Because if you believe what you say you believe, it'll probably show up in the way you live. I worked at a restaurant, and I also worked at a church. Those were the really fun days. So I would leave church, change into my, whatever you call it, apparel, and then I would drive super fast, smell like French fries, and work at the restaurant. And the Sunday crowd would come in, and generally speaking, they tip the worst. I've even gotten tracts. I was talking with a guy. Don't ever tip with a tract, like ever. I think God's meeting with you goes twice as long if you tip with a tract. Okay, don't do that. You know how offensive that was for me working at a church, showing up, and they're like, hey, you know what's better than $100? Are you serious right now? No, $100 would be great because I got to buy groceries this week. This is worthless to me, right? Don't ever, that's just a side note, don't ever tip with a tract unless you put a real 100 on top. Maybe then, and even then, I'm concerned, right? You are always an ambassador. Everywhere you go, you are to model what you believe to be true. This is where Christians are pegged as being hypocritical because we talk about God in certain areas and then we neglect God in other areas, and people look at that and they go, I don't think you believe it. Like, I think you're playing games. I think when you're around certain people, you act a certain way, and when you're around me, you don't act that way. If people find out you're a Christian, they're shocked. Like, what? That's not good. Everywhere you go, I just want you to imagine that you're kind of like me when I go to a restaurant and I find out halfway through the meal that the server goes to our church. I'm going, oh, I really, really hope I didn't say anything dumb. Live like that all the time because you are being watched by a world to see if what you believe actually plays out in the way you live. And lastly, and I'll go quick, we must balance truth and grace in this life. Truth is objective. It comes from God. We know what is true about His Word. But we need to have a posture, a tone, and timing of grace. A timing is an important one. I always throw that in there now because you can say the right thing, even in the right posture, at the wrong time, and it's not the right time to say it. I've called this the Esther principle. Esther's told, you can have anything up to the half of my kingdom. She goes, dinner tomorrow. What? Not the right time. What you believe needs to be grounded here. Where the church cannot shake, cannot move, and cannot lose its rooting is in this. Right? So what life is in this book is what we call life here at church. We cannot back off on that. We can't yield on that. But listen, the way that we talk about it, the way that we engage, the way that we posture ourselves in conversations is on us. Jesus is the greatest example of this ever. The woman at the well is the craziest story in all the world. This lady's trying to hide from everyone she's ever known. She doesn't want them to know. She's probably been ostracized. There are a lot of things in her life that she's kept secret, and she doesn't want anyone to know because it's so embarrassing and shameful. Jesus shows up and begins to tell her things that she doesn't want anyone to know. I want you to imagine what that meeting would be like. Right? You're at McDonald's today eating healthy, and some guy sits down and goes, here's the top 5 things you know that exist in your heart that you pray no one in your family or friends ever know. And he starts listing them off. How many of you are like, I knew I should have gone somewhere that was a little better for me, right? I should have gone somewhere else. This is what I get. You would freak out. What does she do? She goes back, tells the very people she tried to keep secrets from all the things about her. Because she finally met someone that knew what was true and right and good and knew everything about her and loved her, and that was the bridge. She'd never experienced that someone could know all that was true and good and right and know her and love her. It seemed that the only people that could love her were the ones that didn't know her, and the ones that actually knew her could never love her. Jesus is this dichotomy. He's a paradox to the people he runs into. Tax collectors and thugs, according to the Bible, are like, hey, we're having a birthday party. Jesus, we want you to come. What? Like, we want you to come, and Jesus then tells them about the kingdom of heaven and how they need to repent. What is happening? Jesus didn't back off on what was true, but he loved people. Church, is this true of us when we meet people and we go, hey, I believe there's some things that God has said are good and right, and I won't budge on that, but I love you? Has your neighbor gone, I've heard things about Christians, you're a Christian, but you don't act like the things I've heard about? What do I do with this? If that isn't happening at some place in your world where people are like, what? But I've heard that Christians hate people like this. And they go, what? But you feel a lot like love right now. If that's not true of us, then we don't have a witness, and we don't have a testimony, and we don't have anything to share. Here's my prayer for us corporately as a church and individually as we gather, is that in some dim way, every person that runs into us and encounters us and we have conversations with would feel as if in a dim way they had encountered Jesus himself. That they would feel freedom and grace, and that wouldn't be because we hid the truth and pretended we didn't believe it, but because we loved them and we postured ourselves and our tone reflected compassion, and that we would be winsome. And that when people talk about Eastmont, they would go, man, I don't agree with a lot of things they believe over there, but man, they love people well. One of the questions we've asked in our elder team for years, these are things we are using as markers and then motivating us into the way we hire, the way that we are doing staffing, the way we do vision, structure, the way that we function, is we ask the question, if Eastmont disappeared today, would anyone outside of these walls care? Would there be gaping holes left in the city because the people of Eastmont were gone? Acts 6 says there was much joy in that city because of the Christian influence. If that is not true because of us, then we have failed in doing our job. So we're to proclaim the excellencies of him who has saved us. We're to live honest, humble, godly lives because primarily we love and know Jesus. And secondarily, that they might see Jesus in us. Let's pray.